We race on to the next contribution by Edgar Pieterse, who is the founding director of the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And he has been an incredibly important voice in what some have called a sort of new urban theories from the South. So he's been an incredibly agile and prolific writer and speaker, and we are really happy and privileged to have you here.
Thank you, Philip, for the generous introduction, and thanks also for the invitation to be here and to be part of the fun to produce the charter. It's been a great privilege and learning experience, and I do feel like, John, I'm in a boot camp. So it's been amazing to listen to everyone and just be exposed to the rich ideas. So the topic that I was asked to speak to is how to build equity. And given I've been reflecting on Bjarke and Francisca's presentation since we're in the same slot, so I think there's a hidden wisdom as to why that's the case. And I'm pondering what that is. I'm not entirely sure because in some ways, Francisca, I thought your presentation was a critique of the environmental modernization that Bjarke kind of represents in this beautiful aesthetic way. That there's politics at the heart of those transitions, and you can't just ignore those politics, especially when we have a whole suite of new technologies that is very difficult to contain. And I guess what struck me, though, is when you went through that whole panoply of EU charters and regulations and laws and so forth, is I guess to be at the receiving end of an EU project that doesn't extend that in solidarity to the rest of the world. So a good friend of mine who leads the trade negotiations between Africa and the EU, Carlos Lopez, would, for example, say the impossibility of having a conversation about carbon trade barriers in terms of Africa's economic development because of this complete inconsistency between the internal conversation for rights and equity and social justice and the complete contradiction of that when it extends. And I guess that's what I meant to speak about. So this is stolen from another friend, Rahul. But it summarizes the long story we're all very familiar with, but that we also, as I think we've seen in the kind of animations earlier, is very quickly forgotten. That we are living in the midst of one of the most extreme moments in history of systemic, structural, persistent, violent exclusion. And we live with those effects. And the question is, how do we think through that condition, the sort of answers that this particular initiative is trying to work through? So the couple of next slides, I won't go into a lot of detail, but what this suggests is that the conversation is really about the red bars. It is about the 10% of income earners that aggregate a ridiculous amount of income and wealth around the world. And the second chart is the most important one, because what that shows is that if we look at average wealth growth between 95 and 2021, is that the top 10% aggregates almost 40% of all global wealth growth. And so this is right in the heart of these incredible technological transitions and the emergence of a sustainability consciousness, if you will. So it means there's something deeply, deeply problematic in the translation of these normative frameworks into economic and political systems and institutions and regulations. Now, turning to Africa and zooming in on thinking about equity at the neighborhood scale within a typical African city, it's important to recognize, of course, and Bjarke does have a point, that industrial modernity has delivered improvement in living standards, improvement in education and so forth. But where we are in 2022 with an eye on 2050 is at a moment where, of course, the future of work is profoundly uncertain. And so when you look at the distribution of people in poverty will be essentially in sub-Saharan Africa looking forward based on UN data. That blue block there represents a trebling of the labor force between now and 2050 in Africa. And currently, 70, some urban areas, 80% of urban employment is informal. Now, the informality point is not so important, but it is the fact that when you are in informal employment is your income is extremely low, And more perniciously, it is variable. So you can't plan as a household. You can't invest because you always have to, if you will, anticipate profound dislocation or crises and so forth. And of course, climate events in particular render these people most vulnerable. And then, of course, people are not just in informal jobs, but they also live informally. And so dealing with this reality as an explosive expansion in a global context of profound inequality, where the structural drivers of exclusion is baked into the global economy and its reinforcing rules, particularly the global trading system, and more importantly, the financing system, there are no easy answers, even if we know exactly what to do in technological terms, right? Even if we know exactly what to do, there are no easy answers because these are political questions. Now, if we turn the wealth distribution to who's responsible for the carbon problem, we're back to the 10%. So this graph captures by world region the share of 10% that aggregates the bulk of the wealth and what their carbon contributions are. And so it is very clear if we want to talk equity, the 10% is where we've got to start. I can't do that today because I'm not going to speak to the people who live on the right-hand side, which is the 10% in Cape Town, but I'm going to speak to the 50% of the distribution that lives on the left-hand side, who are not responsible for the climate crisis the Bauhaus initiative is trying to resolve. They're not. And they're not going to be in their lifetimes because they're not going to have the incomes to be responsible for it. But be that as it may, because that represents the majority of the cities that I'm interested in, I am curious about what's possible at that scale. And so this is the context that the rest of my remarks refers to. This is Kibera in Kenya. And so I guess, what do we mean by equity? So I want to have, this is almost a kind of common sense understandings, but I think it is important because it goes to the heart of how we think of what a design response might be. Because whatever that design response is, we've got to factor it into what the fiscal model is for this grand experiment. I am definitely not going to call it a global plan or Earth plan, but for this grand experiment that we are imagining. And so I want to briefly reflect on these ideas, and it has definite continuities with the discussions that have come up earlier and with presentations that will follow later in this session. And so for me, equity is not just about access to income or enhanced livelihoods and so on, or even the SDGs. It is about these three things. So let me say very briefly what I mean by this. So fundamentally, individuals, yes, as we've heard, but more individuals in their social relationships desire and aspire for meaning and for pleasure in life, of course. And there's all kinds of social activities they do to achieve that. But what the SDGs are interested in, of course, is this idea of security in a foundational sense. So it's these map very neatly into Amartya Sen's capabilities. And of course, the SDGs is really the Millennium Development Goals, which was kind of the first wave of trying to codify and aggregate the capabilities frame. But then we realized, oh my God, we didn't deal with the environmental externalities enough. And more importantly, we haven't dealt with inequality. So we now have two SDGs that deal with gender equity and of course with inequality writ large. But it is really at the intersection of these things that people find emotional attachment to play. And this for me has got to be, if you will, the ephemeral zone that has got to preoccupy our best thinking and experimentation and so forth. But the important thing is it does not get delivered through physical infrastructure. So it's not just the SDG, right? It is a much more complex dynamic, which of course is precisely as Francesca said, this is a governance project. This is a citizenship project. This is a participatory initiative. So the flourishing stuff is a whole nother story on its own, but I think it is worthwhile figuring out how do we blend into our explorations and a whole nother set of conversations about what does it mean to fundamentally rethink education from early childhood development through to postgraduate education. And there is, if we have our institutions are lagging and our governance systems are lagging by 100, 150 years in terms of where society is at, our educational institutions lag probably by about 60 years. And so there's a massive urgency to fundamentally rethink that. But I guess as designers and urbanists, we can maybe have a very simple question. Can we remember what a life, a home, a street, a neighborhood might look like and feel like if it is fundamentally based on expanding the capacity for love among children, right? What could that be? What if that's the only question we try and answer? However, unfortunately, we have to go back to the bigger picture. So what are the obstacles to that kind of inequality? And of course, spatial inequality. So what spatial inequality represents is a materialization of these larger structural forces, right? And so, at least in the African context, and that's a shopping mall also in Nairobi, in the same place where Kibera is. But what we see are three main drivers of spatial inequality. And why I'm talking about drivers is because even though there's an uptick in discourse on sustainability, there is a greater increase in the reproduction of inequality because it's, again, baked into the system. So, of course, real estate market logics drive urban development just about everywhere. And it is very difficult to shift because, of course, it's the backbone of the fiscal model. So if you don't have an alternative resource for financing infrastructure, it ain't going to shift, right? So I'm not even talking about all of the cultural and sociological ways in which construction industries and property companies embed themselves in local governance systems and finance political parties, but that's a story for another day. But of course, there is this other complicated issue, which was exactly the point that Francis Carrier raised this morning, imaginary, right? There's deeply entrenched desires and imagination about the forms of late informational modernity that structure and drive aspiration. And then we deal with these long stretches of path-dependent dynamics, the cities we've got, the cities that were bequeathed to us through the legacies and the overhang of colonialism and extractive capitalism that we're at the receiving ends of. And so what we've seen with rapid urbanization over the last 20, 25 years on the continent is that the spatial outcome of these economic, cultural, and historical dynamics is undeniably sprawl, but it is marked by an ever-deepening dualism between classes, cultures, the built environment, and nature, and definitely a reinforcement of systemic inequality and exclusion. The trends are crystal clear. And again, this is at the same moment that we've seen an uptick in discourse and rhetoric. That's the exact opposite, right? And so how might we build equity in that context? So obviously, I can't provide answers after that setup. So all I can do is tell three stories from three places. And hopefully from that, we can get an intimation of what it is that we might be searching for and how we might systematize the knowledge platforms that could articulate these experiments, and which is why I'm here, because I think this particular initiative could be a very powerful generator of the collective learning infrastructure we need to fast-track learning. So there's a whole set of stuff in these contexts around what I would call everyday dimensions of equity. And of course, there's the basics about access to infrastructure, water, energy, and so forth. But dignity is as important a structuring variable of equity as any physical infrastructure. And jobs, economic opportunity, jobs, economic jobs, I can't say jobs more sort of often enough. And critically in our context, because where you do have progressive policies that gets introduced, and they do, all the UN Habitat stuff, they translate, and so on, the right to the city, this, that, and the other. The problem is administration and bureaucracy and policy remains viciously arbitrary. People get exploited at a whim, precisely because police officers don't get paid properly. And so the only available form of accumulation is extortion, right, if you live in these contexts. And so we've had lots of debates, and we've heard aspects of this today, bioregionalism as a new scale for planning and calibration, metropolitan government as a way of aggregating fragmented local authorities to improve management and align. And then we've heard examples, and the super blocks for me is an example of a kind of hyper-localism that could only emerge in Barcelona in a very special way. And then, of course, critically, Francisca's presentation, and which is being baked into the frameworks that she was referencing there, this critical issue of interoperability, so that you can have a kind of seamless, transparent, at least that is the ambition and the vision, articulation across these scales, because we do need to to operate. And I guess, again, what we, in the first presentation in this afternoon, saw is precisely the kind of almost animation of data flows and metrics, right? If you get that stuff right. Now, I'm not too, I think the Paris story about the 15-minute city or the movements around 20-minute neighborhoods, that's all fine and well and good and, you know, great. But the real issue, of course, are the articulation of these scales. And the higher you go up the scale, the more depth you can make on reversing systemic power inequality. But I can't talk about that today. I don't have time. I'll just end off with a couple of examples on the hyperlocals. I need to make this point. So a lot of the work at the moment in this is about, you know, trying to articulate these three aspects, right? Sustainable infrastructure, the green building fit, and of course in the European context, the retrofit imperative. And of course that demands a radically different frame for regulation and institutional reform, which is lagging. But actually there's a much more profound question, right? We can't solve those stuff until the philosophical disconnect between property regimes and ecosystem services is not resolved. And we haven't done the philosophical work. We haven't done the legal work. There isn't a framework, and come back to your point about land, Ibiarka's kind of input earlier, and that's the problem. And so if there's a meta question for me that this movement could animate, it would be to begin to bring the brains together to do that, because until we resolve that, all of the dangers we've heard of today are gonna come to pass, because that's our history as a species, right? So for us, the frames we're working with is to, you know, so formal economy jobs is not an option in Africa. It's not going to happen because of when our industrialization is happening, and so the bus has left the station, we're not on it. And so we've got to really think from first principles, how do we build imaginaries of local economies that can deal with large-scale unemployment and informal employment. So ideas around circular and care economy, powerful, potentially really interesting, aggregate forms in that social enterprises or co-ops or various forms of collective enterprise. We're trying to work through, if we take all of the various infrastructure systems in the city and we really rethink that value chain and we rethink the capital labor ratio in each of those so that it's all returns to questions of placemaking, what that could look like. What we've found in that work is that at the moment, there's no way the financing systems can align with that if you do it. None of the, even the green finance stuff, even the climate finance stuff, none of it can finance any of these models, right? Another big disconnect. So a couple of examples, and I only have, so what does that mean? I have 2 minutes left or 50 seconds? 53, okay. Now I know there's it goes off at 18, but we have 20 minutes, so I never know. Okay, so I just wanted to talk about alternative construction and so on, because there's a great project in placemaking from Nairobi to kind of close the loop. Interesting experiment, uses only 5% of the cement component if you use traditional cement and not Wales' fantastic solution. But it clears alien vegetation in South Africa, which consumes 100 times more water than indigenous fauna. It creates a wood pulp that, in terms of tensile strength, in terms of a whole bunch of properties, outperforms conventional brick and mortar by 1,000%, et cetera, et cetera. The main point is that it can all be done with 0 machines, except for the wood chip machine, in terms of the production process, and a form of slurry, okay. So anyway, that experiment is running on the Cape Flats, and so a whole bunch of questions about how we would institutionalize that. The second point is a bunch of work on the informal condition, using particularly creches, which are in shacks that look like that, and transforming them through local labor and local materials into more habitable and livable environments that invites play and learning and so on. And using that methodology to focus on a whole bunch of public infrastructures in a typical township condition in Cape Town, whether it's the school grounds, it's playgrounds, it's open space, etc., and so on. This project I want to just show you because it is such a powerful example of what could be done. And it takes on, for me, what I would regard as situated innovation, and I'll end off with that as a final comment. So this group has built a fascinating framework for upgrading of public infrastructure using green, blue, and gray infrastructures. And this is just one example of the transformation that's possible at the edge of the dam in Kibera. And they've rolled this out across 12 public spaces in that particular neighborhood using only local organizations. membership-based, and local technologies and so forth. The point is that, you know, this is what that enables, right, is a situated innovation. And for me, if, you know, Erica was still here and we could get into a proper debate, the critical piece is missing. There's quite a bit of systems thinking, quite a lot of design thinking, a lot of technology, but there's no critical thought about historical path dependencies or about power or about any of those things, right? And we can't afford that. And these solutions will only emerge in situ through participatory processes, but we do need to aggregate that into a set of frameworks that we can disseminate very quickly. So I'm out of time, so I'll stop and I'll leave the conclusions there and people can read that themselves. Thank you very much.
Quick comments, questions from the audience. Sheila?
I wish I could speak up this. Because from the morning and in our discussions on the new Bauhaus framework, I feel that we are talking only about the tip of the iceberg, which is the formal world. We've forgotten the indigenous people, we've forgotten the informal people, we've forgotten landless agricultural workers. We've left 1/3 of humanity out of this discussion. And the exclusion and the excitement of those beautiful visuals just reminds all of us that there is no clarity in our framework about what constitutes inclusion. And I think that from now onwards, however fabulous your presentations are, they must feel accountable. Just as you feel accountable to the planet, you have to feel accountable for 1/3 of the population that has been excluded for multiple generations. And we are not doing that. So Edgar, thank you. You've laid the outline for me. I don't have to say any of this tomorrow. Thank you.
John?
No, Sheila, I'd like to make a comment on that. I mean, you're absolutely right, and you've been a champion of this debate for many years now, but in general, we talk about the problems of the wealthy part of the world population, the top billion, and we completely forget about the bottom billions, which live in Kibera, for example, and in many of our informal settlements. The problem is that the top billion is creating conditions on Earth that will destroy the globe for the entire population. So those people who do not live in luxury, not even are able to make a living, their very slim foundation for making a living will be even destroyed by the rich billion. That is the bitter irony of it. So it makes sense if Europe or America tries to stop the emissions of CO2, for example, or the destruction of biodiversity through foreign trade and things like that, because this is the necessary condition for life on Earth, also for the bottom billions. But it's not sufficient, of course, not at all. So you have the human suffering of all these bottom billions and so on, who live in informal settlements and so on. But the bitter irony is that the luxury billion, so to speak, is able to destroy the planet for everybody. Yeah? That's why we need to find a solution in Europe, in the global north, but we have to team up with the global south. But even, that's why I asked this question, what if CO2 would not be a greenhouse gas? And still we would have misery all over the planet. But if we are not able to solve the climate problem, then we all will be toast, 10 billion people on this planet.
Thank you. I think Edgar, you have the right, of course, to reply. Yeah, sure.
Sorry, no, you want to move on. No, so just one point, John, on that, and I completely get where you're coming from, but I guess what frustrates me is that why is reparations not on the agenda of the European Union? Why? Both in terms of slavery and in terms of climate. And secondly, apart from that, there is a redistributive question. So if you look at what's happened to the debates on ODA and the 0.7% and so forth, I mean, it's positively regressive, right? Especially in the last 15 years, where there has been this sleight of hand, where trade relations is treated as ODA. So just if one could, so if we're talking about what I refer to as the 10% of the distribution, or the top billion in your terms, then let's at least include that in the agenda as well as a starting point. Because if you don't have a mechanism to deal with the relationality between that 1 billion and the rest at a global scale, financially speaking, then we're kind of nowhere, even if we solve for the billion.
And again, I fully agree. So let's put it on the agenda, actually.
Joachim von Braun.
Let me just underline Sheila and Edgar. We in the Pontifical Academy of Science deeply care about equity. All our conferences have to be global and international. We do care about policy change in Europe, but that's a small part of the story. So John and I completely agree that this needs to be on the agenda, and you are here to set agenda and not just that's why you are on the agenda. So let me just assure you, your statement has to include that. Otherwise, it's not relevant for us. The statement has to include the equity, exclusion, marginalization agenda, that reconstruction is otherwise not of our interest.
Thank you. So we have accumulated a little more than 1 hour delay in our schedule, which is not entirely the fault of this session. I have to make sure that people understand. So I'm Joachim von Braun. I'm looking to you as a higher master of ceremony here. Are we allowed to shorten the break a little bit, maybe from 20 minutes to 5 minutes? I know it's a not very popular proposal, but
popularity is not what we are after in this meeting. These are big issues. I think, however, that coffee breaks are extremely productive conversation time. I would lean more towards extending a bit at the end, if that is at all feasible. But otherwise, we have to cut the coffee break to really 10 minutes.